Climate change is an incredibly important topic for us to cover in our science curriculum. Few crises are so global in scope, so time sensitive, and so serious in their potential consequences if left unaddressed. And yet, the paradox of climate change is that as a species, we already have the knowledge, technology, and ability to solve the crisis. Climate change is a socio-political problem as much as it is an environmental issue. As educators, we have the ability and opportunity to give our students the scientific literacy and knowledge they need in order to understand the crisis we face and demand action themselves. When teaching this topic, you are likely to come across many misconceptions about climate change, often just the simple results of students conflating different topics, or getting hung up on vocabulary, or misremembering something they heard that one time. In this video, we'll go through some of the most common misconceptions you are likely to face during this unit on climate change. Many of these misconceptions are listed and outlined in detail in the teacher guide for the unit, starting on page 10. A couple of weeks ago, students learned about the difference between weather and climate, but even knowing that difference, it's possible to draw some erroneous conclusions. For example, every winter, especially after a particularly bad snowstorm, we often see social media posts something along the lines of, "So much for global warming," or "Sure could use some of that global warming right now." Of course, even though the global climate is changing and warming overall, that doesn't mean it will no longer be cold anywhere on Earth. In fact, a warming climate can exacerbate storms, extreme weather events, and temperature fluctuations, mostly because warmer oceans mean more evaporation, which fuels those storms. That means we can expect larger, more severe storms even in the winter. Students might also point out that, while the weather changes all the time with dramatic temperature fluctuations, for example, just recently in New York City, it reached 80 degrees just days after a high in the 40s. If no one worries about a temperature difference that great, then what's the big deal about a global temperature increase of just a couple degrees? However, let's remember that the global temperature increase is just an average. Many locations, especially around the poles, will experience more than that average. And even a global rise in temperatures of just a couple of degrees does in fact fuel some disastrous results, such as increasing hurricanes, droughts, wildfires, as we've seen in the US and Australia in the past couple of years, and sea level rise. These dramatic consequences fall outside a normal range of natural fluctuations and may occur too quickly for most other species to adapt quickly enough to survive. Students may also believe that since the Earth's climate has been dramatically different in the past, think Ice Age, this newer warming trend is no cause for alarm, or maybe even that it's a natural thing. However, there is no doubt that the current high levels of CO2 in the atmosphere are due to human activity, and were not present in the past to nearly this extent. Furthermore, the current warming period we're in has occurred far more rapidly than any previous natural warming period. It's clear that this is not normal, it's not natural, and human activity is to blame. Another common misconception is to equate the terms climate change and global warming. While both terms have been in use for a long time in the scientific community, global warming refers specifically to the increase in global average temperature over time due to human activity. Climate change includes global warming, but also includes extreme weather events and other effects that occur as a result of this warming. Another very common misconception you're likely to hear from students is that climate change is caused by pollution, or that littering is a contributing factor. Ask students to think through and explain more about what they mean by those words and how this could work. We usually use pollution to mean releasing any harmful substance into the environment, while littering just means throwing or dumping trash improperly. Neither of these things on their own are directly related to climate change, which is primarily caused by the large amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere due to human activity. Related misconceptions are that greenhouse gases are toxic or a form of pollution, or that carbon dioxide is toxic, or that it's the only greenhouse gas. Greenhouse gases include water vapor and ozone, and we certainly need those. Another greenhouse gas is methane. We need some amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, or the Earth would not retain any heat at all. It would be a frozen, lifeless planet. Additionally, these gases are not toxic in any sense that our students likely mean, harmful or deadly at any dose. Without CO2 in the atmosphere at all, there would be no plants. After all, a tree's mass comes almost entirely from the carbon and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In addition to a stable, warm enough climate, plants need carbon dioxide in order to perform photosynthesis and grow. Of course, with all this talk of CO2, students might begin thinking that it's a significant part of the atmosphere. But actually, the vast majority of our atmosphere is made of nitrogen gas, with oxygen composing about a fifth of our atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, all the other gases we're talking about comprise altogether only 1% of all of the gases in the atmosphere. That's how powerful these gases really are. And yet, too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere causes more than just warming. The ocean also absorbs CO2 from the air, and too much causes the ocean to become more acidic. This contributes to the bleaching and death of coral reefs around the world. Another common misconception is that greenhouse gases emitted as a result of using fossil fuels are the only cause of climate change. This is not true. Deforestation, for example, contributes by removing a huge source of carbon storage and recycling from the environment. Think about how much carbon a tree can store. It's what they're made out of. Removing trees from the equation means more carbon left in the atmosphere. Much of this deforestation is itself to support agriculture and livestock, which are enormous sources of greenhouse gas emissions, especially methane from the livestock. This might surprise students who believe that greenhouse gases come primarily from driving cars, as many do. Although transportation is a contributor, commercial transportation is a bigger driver of emissions than personal car travel. One of the other main drivers of greenhouse gas emissions is actually generating electricity. Other contributors include farming, agriculture, and livestock, as well as industrial uses of fossil fuels. Of course, there are many misconceptions about what can or can't be done to mitigate the effects of climate change. At one extreme are those who say that nothing can be done. It's too late and we lack the technology. Neither of those statements are true. We do still have time to stop some of the effects of climate change and mitigate others. We can reduce greenhouse gas emissions to reduce the rate of warming and even stop it. We can also mitigate the effects of climate change to reduce the severity of those effects on human communities. We already have the ability, the knowledge, and the tools that we need in order to do so. We just aren't doing it. In this sense, as I said before, climate change is not so much an environmental issue as it is a political and a social issue. At the other extreme, from those who say there's nothing we can do, are those who might say that the choices of individual consumers are the key to stopping climate change. Helping could just mean walking or biking to work or school instead of driving your car, for example. If only everyone turned off the lights when they left the room. Let's think about these statements. Although driving cars is not a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, it does contribute. However, there are many ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Reducing the amount of disposable products you use can help, especially plastics, which are derived from fossil fuels and for the most part not recyclable. Using more energy efficient electronics, reducing your heat or air conditioning use, especially in commercial buildings, which reduces your overall electricity consumption. Now, with enough individuals making those choices, they can have large-scale effects. Reforesting efforts, especially in heavily deforested areas like the Amazon rainforest, can also help because trees capture and store carbon for long periods of time. And fossil fuels are called fossil fuels because they are the fossilized remains of ancient plants. They trap a ton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Eating less meat can also be a great step on a personal level because energy and land-intensive livestock are enormous contributors of greenhouse gases, and deforestation is often done to support those industries. And of course, projects like installing solar panels can also reduce dependence on fossil fuels to produce electricity. But while these small-scale individual acts can add up if enough people do them, these acts alone cannot counter centuries of industrial fossil fuel use and global deforestation. In fact, the idea of a personal carbon footprint that each individual consumer should be focused on was created and marketed by the company British Petroleum, now BP, in the early 2000s, specifically to shift focus and blame from corporate and industrial contributors onto individual consumers. Acting only on a personal scale will not solve the problem on its own without addressing systemic problems in the industrial world. These individual acts must be paired with political and social activism at a larger scale in order to effect change. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list. There are plenty of other misconceptions students may bring up. Some say that the sun causes global warming, or that the greenhouse gas effect is caused by humans, or that the hole in the ozone layer is because of climate change. None of these statements is true either. but hopefully this video has helped you address some of the most common misconceptions that students may have. Climate change is a difficult topic to teach, but it's a necessary one. After all, our students will be dealing with the consequences of climate change, so it is our responsibility to make sure they are as well prepared as possible.